So Susan, the floor to you.
Thanks very much, Domenico, and thanks also to the IAI for organizing the session, and thanks to all of you for coming. The IMF's role in the eurozone crisis, if there's one thing you should take away from the session today, it's that it was path-breaking and it was complicated. It's an old adage in economics that it's good to complicate things because then nobody is going to understand them and no one can ask questions about sensitive issues. Now, I wouldn't want to suggest that the IMF or the euro area set out to complicate this episode, but it was an unintended consequence. Too many people just don't understand what's going on. The IMF's role in the euro crisis is a big question, and I'm sure that each of the panelists here is going to come at it from a different angle. Mine is going to be whether the innovations in the way the IMF handled the eurozone crisis as opposed to previous crises enhanced or detracted from the IMF's ability to help contain contagion and to get countries in crisis back on the road again. I'm going to start with a small amount of background on what the IMF is supposed to do and what it's not supposed to do. Some of this is going to be repetition. For some of you, you're going to know it, but for the non-economists here, it'll probably get us all on the same page. Then I'm going to ask a couple of questions and talk about the innovations that the IMF undertook in the eurozone crisis. Okay, first the background. The IMF started after World War II as a reserve pooling arrangement. That's an arrangement where a lot of countries put some reserves into a central pool, and when any of them hits a rough spot, they can take out the reserves that they put in, as well as more, some of the reserves other countries put in, and this helps the countries through rough spots. As time went by, though, the IMF began to see that some countries were constantly taking money from the pool, and some countries were not only constantly doing it, they really weren't ever repaying. They just kept rolling over the money that they took from the pool. So the IMF said, this isn't the way it's supposed to work. This is supposed to be a revolving fund. Countries are supposed to take out, put back in. So what we need to do is set some conditions on economic policies in the countries that take money from the pool so that the IMF isn't fundamentally financing a set of bad policies that are going to prevent a country from ever breaking free of using those pooled resources. So this is the beginning of conditionality in the fund. Then along came a new era, and let's call this around the 1990s, when capital flows, global capital flows, began to balloon. So that countries didn't just land up with an asymmetry between imports and exports. They actually had become incredibly reliant on foreign financing, private sector financing, to continuously finance large current account deficits. So the potential for crises became absolutely vast. There could be huge crises, way bigger than any that we had ever known in the past. So think Mexico in 1994, the Asian crises in the late 1990s, Russia in 1998, Brazil 1999, Turkey 2000. Really, really big crises that began to strain even the ability of the IMF to finance, and certainly strained the ability of countries to repay their private creditors and the fund. So about 10 years ago, the IMF set itself some rules. The rules were geared toward helping it decide when a country was strong enough to repay private creditors and the IMF, and when it fundamentally wasn't going to be strong enough to repay without crushing its economy. So when it was not going to be, when the IMF would determine it was not going to be strong enough to repay the full amount of its foreign borrowing and the IMF, it was to signal, to put up a red flag and say, this is an unsustainable situation. It's a situation in which we can't expect the country actually to make good on all of these commitments. This was supposed to be very unusual. It wasn't that every country that started borrowing could suddenly say, well, we just can't pay. But in some unusual circumstances, this judgment had to be made. In other words, in these cases, it was required that the IMF state from the outset that there was a clear path to a country regaining its economic footing, to be able to repay and to regain growth in its economy. And this was for the benefit not only of the country, but also so that financial markets could understand how the country was going to get out of this crisis, and for regional partners who were going to suffer from contagion and weaknesses in the debtor country itself. So this was sort of a new role for the IMF. 10 years ago, the IMF set up a bunch of formal rules, parsimonious, very sparing, not elaborate, very simple, but rules on how it should decide when a country could repay and when a country could not. Okay, that's it for background. What I want to do now is talk about two aspects of the IMF's involvement in the euro crisis, specifically the Troika arrangement to which Domenico just referred, and a relaxation of the rules that the IMF set itself just 10 years ago to determine when a country could and could not repay its private creditors. These were both innovations in the IMF's way of dealing with crises that had important effects not only on how the euro crisis unfolded, but also will have important effects on how the IMF engages in future crises in other parts of the world. I'm going to ask two questions. I'm going to answer both of them, and my answers are going to be very blunt because of the time constraint. The first question: was the Troika arrangement a good innovation? Now, you're going to have to bear with a little bit more background before you get to my answer. The Troika, as Domenico just said, was the label for the sharing of responsibility between the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission for the strategy, the negotiations, and the funding of for the four countries that the IMF lent to. That is Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Cyprus. This arrangement, this Troika arrangement, was an innovation. It was a departure from the way the IMF behaved in all past crises, where IMF management had the ultimate responsibility, in conjunction and in consultation with all fund members, but still the ultimate responsibility for negotiating and for proposing action to its executive board. In other words, to proposing that the board approve loans to a crisis country. Now, the logic for the Troika lay largely in the fact that the crisis countries were part of a currency union, and this was unique. Well, it was unusual. It actually wasn't unique. The IMF has lent to other countries in currency unions without a Troika-type arrangement. The problem with the Troika arrangement is that the experience reveals that it has weakened the objectivity that the IMF needs to bring to discussions, such as when a country can repay its debt and when it should not be held accountable for all of its debt. It should restructure in combination with taking adjustment policies, and the fund should help the country in those circumstances. So was the Troika a good innovation? I would say it was a flawed innovation. First, it unleashed unusually severe political influence on the IMF. And in turn, the IMF could not bring the full force of its very vast experience in managing financial crises and ensure that all the options for dealing the crisis were put on the table and carefully considered. This is one important contributory factor, in my view, to prolonging the crisis and, indeed, worsening contagion. Second, looking ahead, this Troika arrangement is likely to set a precedent that could weaken the IMF's role in other crises in the future. This is because the distinction between the traditional crisis country IMF relationship and the currency union IMF relationship is going to become increasingly gray. There are other reserve pooling arrangements that are emerging in other parts of the world. The Asian countries have one called the Chiang Mai Initiative, and just last week at the G20 conference, the BRICS, the 5 BRICS countries, agreed on a $100 billion scheme for reserve pooling among their countries. A crisis in any of these countries, given the precedent set in Europe, is going to raise substantial challenges for the IMF's independence, as imperfect as it already was. My second question is whether relaxing the rules on when debt should be restructured was a good innovation. As I said, just 10 years ago, the IMF set up a very compact set of rules to provide guidance on situations when countries should borrow from the fund, have an adjustment program, and fully repay their creditors, and when it's necessary to ask creditors to take part of the hit and have an adjustment program and IMF lending alongside that. So was relaxing these rules a good idea? Again, you're going to have to listen to some background. The Euro Crises, and I use the plural here because the crises were very different in different countries. The origins of the crises were very different in different countries. They were always going to be very difficult to address. I'm going to focus here on Greece because Greece was the first of these crises and it was a pace setter for how the IMF engaged in the other countries. There were 2 problems in Greece, 2 basic problems in Greece. One was competitiveness, the other was excessive sovereign debt. On competitiveness, there was actually very little room to debate once the preference of the euro area and Greece for there to be no exit from the euro area was established. Some combination of a recession-induced and a structural reform-induced improvement in competitiveness was going to be essential. The program tried both of these. Unfortunately, the Greeks have been a little more rigorous in pursuing the recession part, less rigorous in pursuing the structural reform part. On sovereign debt, the story is quite different, though. The IMF knows, and as I said earlier, it has even engraved explicitly in its terms of engagement in crisis countries, that markets need to be shown upfront a path to returning debt to a manageable level, what in fund parlance is called debt sustainability. You all have undoubtedly heard that term thrown around, and most people don't really have a clue what debt sustainability is, but quite simply, it's just the path debt is going to take to get back to a manageable level. Without making this path clear to markets, either by showing that a country can repay and still regain its economic footing, or by moving to a restructuring quickly, uncertainty becomes self-reinforcing, interest rate spreads widen, and there really can be no hope of returning a country to market access, which is, in the end, the sine qua non of a fund program. The Greek program to this day has no clear path to debt sustainability. On current plans, even in 10 years, debt in Greece is going to be well over 100% of GDP. The IMF changed the rules to go ahead, changed its own rules in order to proceed with the loan to Greece, and it did so by saying, we will go ahead and lend to Greece, even though we're not sure how Greece is going to get its debt back to this manageable level. So my answer on whether this innovation, this relaxation of the rules on how a country gets its debt back to a sustainable position, was it a good innovation? My answer is absolutely not. The fund changed a time-proven rule and allowed, and in fact continues to allow, the program to proceed without a clear path to debt sustainability. Markets even now are left guessing whether there's going to be more EU financing of Greece or whether there's going to be more debt restructuring. And as you can imagine, markets are loath to lend when they're not sure what the future is going to bring. As I've said, lending to individual members of a currency union was always going to be complicated and messy. But these 2 changes in the way the IMF does business were unfortunate departures from past practices. In my view, then, they contributed to prolonging the euro crisis But they also became poor precedents for the IMF's role in future crises. I therefore hope to see members of the IMF review this experience, recognize the flaws in these two procedures, sharing responsibilities in a Troika-type arrangement, and funding programs without a clear path to debt sustainability, and agree on changes for the future. Thank you very much.